So this morning we're actually wrapping up our series that we've called Purpose Built. Now, if you weren't here for the rest of it, I'll catch you up as we go along. But our key idea here is that as a church, as an organization, like any organization, we have a purpose. We are here for a reason. And if we don't understand what that reason is, if we don't agree on that reason, we're going to have a really hard time working together. So the point of all this is to help us align around our purpose. Kind of another way to kind of address that is, when I walk in here on any given day, I ask myself a question. Why does the United Church of Warner exist? Because if I can't answer that question, if nothing is any different because we're here, then it's going to be really hard to make a difference. So we need to answer that question, and we need to live and work in a way consistent with the answer to that question. And so, why do we exist? To inspire people to pursue and find life in Jesus. Right? We don't exist to tell people they're doing things wrong. We don't exist to pressure people into making a choice. We exist to demonstrate with our actions and with our words something that is inspirational, something that draws people into that relationship, that opportunity for a personal relationship with God through Jesus. That's why we exist. Now, that's a pretty lofty goal because there's a lot of things that have to go into doing that well. So that means that, of course, over time, we have to actually build a game plan. We have to execute that game plan. We've got to do that successfully. But there's something we have to do even before that. Before we even start laying out the details of a game plan, the first thing we have to do is develop the appropriate mindset. Right? How do we think about what we're doing? How do we think about what we want to do? How do we think about people? How do we think about kind of everything, right? What's that perspective that we work from when we decide the sort of things that we want to do? And so as we've gone through the series, we would kind of talk about a point, and then to kind of demonstrate that point, we would spend a few minutes in the book of Ruth. And we'll do that again today, and we'll actually finish up the book of Ruth. But before we get into that detail, let's think about this idea of the appropriate mindset. What's the right state of mind to have as we try to fulfill this purpose? Well, if our purpose is to inspire people to pursue and find life in Jesus, what's a good place to look for the right mindset? What did Jesus do? He inspired people to pursue and find life in Him. So if we look at the sort of things that He does, and we look at His mindset about when He does things, that gives us a sense of the right mindset for us. So what I'd like to look at just briefly is something that happened very early in the ministry of Jesus. It's actually captured for us by the gospel writer Luke. Remember that Luke was simply writing a biography of Jesus' life. And he captures this one moment that really, I think, really shows us what the right mindset is. Because one of the things that we see in the life of Jesus is Jesus consistently prioritized the same thing. He prioritized people. He put people, relationship with people, wellness with people, among everything else. He put it ahead of religious traditions. He put it ahead of religious activity. He basically said that the way that you honor God is by honoring the people that you encounter. Now, you might think that if he is such a people person, that all the people liked him. But not everyone did like him. Because what was actually happening is that as Jesus put this heavy focus on people and their wellness and their well-being and their needs, it actually put him at odds with the religious structure of his time. Because in his time, the religious leaders did not prioritize people. And what they prioritized? They prioritized rules. They prioritized formalities. They prioritized you have to do things a certain way. They put those things ahead of people. And Jesus refused to follow that model. Jesus says that I am going to care for people. That is why I'm here. That is what God is calling each of us to do. And so there was this constant tension that went on between Jesus and the religious leaders of his time. So one day, again, early in Jesus' ministry, he's traveling. He's actually traveling with a few of his disciples. And so they're walking. And they're walking on the Sabbath day, meaning the Jewish holy day. And the thing that's important to remember is that this idea of a Sabbath day dated back to kind of the original ancient Hebrews. And when the Sabbath day was first created, it was intended very specifically for a purpose. To be a day of rest, a day of rejuvenation, a day to take time to connect with God, break away from your work, and also to take time to connect with people. But then over the years, the religious leaders who were very enamored with formality and rules started layering formality and rules on the Sabbath day. And it takes this day that was intended to be rejuvenating and healthy and connection between people and God. And he took this thing that was intended for good and turned it into a burden. They would do things like you have to count how many steps you take on a day, because if you take one extra step, well, that's going to offend God, right? That sort of thing. Basically, what the religious leaders had done had made the rules about the Sabbath more important than the people that the Sabbath was created to care for. And that was really inconsistent with the sort of thing that Jesus was interested in doing. So basically, as Jesus is traveling on this Sabbath day, he encounters a man who has an issue with one of his hands. We don't really know what it is. They use the term, it's a withered hand. So his hand just doesn't work properly. And as Jesus walks up to speak to the man, the religious leaders start watching him really closely. Because even though this was really early in Jesus' ministry, word was getting around that this Jesus guy is kind of different. That when he spends time with people, these people seem to be rejuvenated. When he spends time with people, people who are sick are getting well. People with ailments seem to be having them healed. So the religious leaders are watching Jesus really closely. Now, we might think that they're watching him closely because, like, how cool would it be to see Jesus heal somebody, right? That's what I would be interested in. But that wasn't what they were interested in. They started talking amongst themselves, go, we think you might heal that guy. Healing, that sounds a lot like work. We don't work on the Sabbath day. So they were actually angry and upset because he might actually do good for someone. And so they watch him really closely. And Jesus is aware of what they're doing. So basically, we're told that Jesus said to his critics, I have a question for you. Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save a life, or is this a day to destroy it? And he waits. And none of his critics will answer. So he spends no more time with them. He turns to the man, and he heals the man. So they now get to see him actually heal someone. What do you think their response is? At this, the enemies of Jesus were wild with rage and began to discuss what to do with him. Now, why was that? Because they felt like he was taking something away from them. They felt that their relationship with God was heavily tied to these rules and burdens. And because of that, they had lost sight of the people. Jesus focusing on the people demonstrated that his mindset was so incredibly different than theirs that they couldn't even understand what he was doing. Because again, they considered these religious things far more important than people. And Jesus is demonstrating to us that the right mindset for all of us is to put people ahead of everything else. Not that there's anything wrong with religious traditions. Many of the traditions these folks followed were really valuable and really important. But as soon as those traditions get in the way of reaching people and impacting lives, Jesus said there's no place for that. And so many of those religious leaders really felt like they were losing something. And it shows that incredibly different mindset. And the thing is that Jesus' mindset was so different from theirs. And honestly, in many ways, Jesus' mindset can be very different from us, because Jesus says things sometimes that are really confusing. You know, he would say things like, love your enemies. Well, wait a minute, aren't I supposed to love my friends but oppose my enemies? Or pray for those who hurt you. I mean, yeah, sure, I'm happy to pray for people who are on my side, but now I'm supposed to pray for people who are actively opposing me? Or do good for others even when they won't do good for you? That feels backwards somehow. Because it feels like what Jesus is describing is we're supposed to give everything up and get nothing in return. And if we kind of look at the world around us, it seems like maybe the right way to think would be to oppose our enemies, to not be in favor of our enemies. But what Jesus wanted us to understand, that in the kingdom of God, this kingdom that he ushered in when he got here, that it is an upside-down kingdom. That instead of taking the things that we say that, well, if you're against me, I'm against you, he says, no, we're for everybody. We are serving everybody. We are reaching out and helping everyone we can. And we will do whatever we can to reach the people around us, even those folks who are not, or we perceive as not, on our side. So today, as we wrap up our series, Purpose Built, that's what I want to talk about. This idea of the upside-down kingdom. That the way we need to do things, the way we are called to do things, can seem very upside down to the way we might be tempted to perceive things. And again, as we look at that idea of this kind of loving those who oppose us, you know, it seems like Jesus is saying that we're responsible to just give up everything and get nothing back. That's what it seems like. But he clarifies that point. He actually says, give and you will receive. Well, that doesn't really clear anything up, does it? Right? But then he goes on to say, and this is crazy, right? Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over, poured out into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. What he is saying that in God's kingdom, when we walk in step with God's kingdom, the more we give, the more we get back. The more we invest in the lives of people around us, the more our life becomes enriched. The more we're willing to let go of things, the more things we find in our lives. That the way to have a full life is not to focus on ourselves. It's when we focus on other people that our lives start to become full. And we're willing to push our boundaries and do things beyond our comfort level to serve other people, to care for other people, to reach people who may seem out of reach. That's where we find fullness. Jesus is saying that in order to have a life that is filled with purpose, that is filled with meaning, that is filled with satisfaction, the answer is not to focus on what's mine. It's not to focus on what I'm owed. It's not to focus on what I can get. The way to have a full and meaningful life is to invest in other people's lives, to serve other people, to connect with people. Using what we have to invest in the lives around us. Because it's actually by investing our lives that's when we begin to find life. Jesus is very explicitly here extending an invitation to be bold, to go outside comfort levels, to go outside the sort of things you've always done, to do something new. Because if you do the same thing you've always done, what do you get? Same thing you always got. If you want to reach the people that no one else is reaching, you got to do what no one else is doing. If you want to reach the people that you can't reach now, you got to try to reach them in a different way. Not because we want something from them, but because we want to inspire them to find life. And Jesus promises that if we are willing to invest our lives, we will find more life than we can ever imagine. And it's that mindset that empowers us to fulfill our own lives. It's that mindset that empowers us to transform the lives around us. It's this willingness to adopt this upside-down mindset that makes all the difference. So now let's go back into the book of Ruth. Right, we'll look at the book of Ruth and see this kind of upside-down mindset and see what it does for the people and what it does for their lives when they're willing to live this upside-down mindset. Now remember that the book of Ruth is a narrative from ancient history, about 3,000 years ago. And remember, we had kind of three main characters. We had Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Remember that Naomi was this aging widow. Then she had actually been grown up in the region of Bethlehem, had moved nearly 1,000 miles away to a foreign country named Moab, her husband, and their two sons. While there, her sons got married to these women from that country. We call them Moabite women. But while she was there, early on, first her husband died, and then both of her sons died. And as we've talked about, in the ancient Near East, it was an extremely patriarchal society. It was almost impossible for a family consisting only of women to take care of themselves. So because of that, Naomi decides to head back to her home country, this home region of Bethlehem. One of her daughter-in-laws, the one named Ruth, comes along with her. So Ruth is willing to step out of her own comfort level to stay with Naomi, to help take care of Naomi. So the two of them return back to Bethlehem. So for Naomi, this was a very comfortable place to go back to. For Ruth, this was an incredibly foreign place to go back to. And because they couldn't really work and they didn't have any resources or any money, they kind of had to scavenge for food. And this was this idea of gleaning, right? Is that the law that they lived under said that landowners had to leave food behind in their fields so that those who were poor could come along and gather food. And by all indications, this was key to Naomi's survival. Because you notice as we go through the story, Naomi never goes out to do the gleaning, which indicates that she's either old or a bit sickly, that she's not actually able to do that on her own. So her survival was directly tied to Ruth. And as Ruth went out into the fields, she encounters this man named Boaz, who is a wealthy man, a man of status, who owns one of the fields. You remember that when we left off last week, Boaz was extending a lot of things to Ruth to make life easier for her, to gather food, to understand what to do, to kind of cut her breaks when she did things she wasn't supposed to do. And that's where we left off last week. But now, as we return this week, a couple of months have passed. And the harvest has been going on, and the harvest has been going well. But that time is starting to wind down. But the good thing that's happening is that Ruth is out there gathering food all the time. So she and Boaz kind of run into each other a lot. And it appears that they're beginning to develop affection for one another. But it's not a time where he can kind of say, hey, you want to go out on a movie? You want to go check something out? Can I take you to dinner? Right? Those weren't really options. And there were a number of issues. So basically, the only time they got to see each other while she's out there working in the field, sweating, dirty, picking up food, laying on the ground, right? Torn up, beat up clothes. She probably wasn't feeling all that pretty many of those days. But they are developing an affection for one another. And Naomi, the older woman that Ruth is taking care of, appears to become aware of this. Now, Naomi has an issue. Naomi could focus on her own interests and say, if Ruth's not here, I don't know how I'll eat. But also, my life is short. I'm older. I'm not going to live much longer. If I die, Ruth is entirely alone in a foreign country. So Naomi could either focus on her own interests and just keep Ruth around, or she could focus on Ruth and say, I think you guys kind of have something developing here. Maybe I can help you kind of get that to the next stage. So she tells Ruth to take a bath, actually. Go clean yourself up, put on some perfume, put on some nice clothes, and go see Boaz. But again, there are these weird social, well, to us weird, I shouldn't say weird, social structures that make them getting together challenging. Because Ruth can't just kind of walk out into the street and go to Boaz, hey, marry me. She can't really do that. So what Naomi, because Naomi understands the culture, Naomi tells Ruth, Boaz and his men are working late at night, processing the harvest. They're going to fall asleep soon. So after you've washed up, go out to where he is and talk to him. And I'll tell you kind of how to get the conversation started. He'll know what to do from there. So during the night, Ruth goes out, sneaks to where the men are at working. They're all asleep. And she does something that looks very strange to us. She walks down onto the floor where they process everything, and she lays down by Boaz's feet. Now, as I said, it seems strange to us, but what she's actually doing is she's demonstrating trust in him. She says, I'm young. I mean, by all accounts, she was probably a young teenager when she got married. She might not even be 20 years old yet at this point. Boaz is an older man, a worldly man, surrounded by working men that no one would ever see what happened. And so she walks in and she lays down at his feet, saying that I know as long as I'm with you, I'm okay. I'm safe. But there's kind of an interesting thing. Boaz wasn't expecting anybody laying at his feet. So he startles him. And basically, he's like, who are you? She says, I'm your servant, Ruth, which was just a term to say, just a humble term to say, I'm your servant, Ruth, not I'm actually your servant. Spread the corner of your covering over me, for you are my family redeemer. Now that statement she makes is filled with things we kind of want to dig into a little bit. Okay, so that first thing there, spread the corner of your covering over me, was actually a phrase that is basically saying, marry me. That actually dates back to kind of some ancient traditions of kind of using covering to say that we are now one as a family. So she's basically saying, will you marry me? But even that feels like a really bold statement because, again, it's a patriarchal society. Men ask women to marry them, not the other way around. But it turns out in this case, it's okay because of the second half of the statement. You are my family redeemer. Remember last week we talked about the fact that this is a culture that lives under Mosaic law. Right? That's the law that was passed down from Moses. And under Mosaic law, we've talked about the fact that there's a lot of things in there to protect the vulnerable. Right? That's why gathering food in the fields was okay, because the law said you had to let the poor do that. Well, there's also things there to protect the interests of families in the event of someone dying. Because in this case, Ruth's husband had died, and they actually owned property. But there are debts tied to that property. And so to pay those debts, that property could be sold. And the same thing, Ruth had been married to a man who had died. We've talked about the fact that it's really hard, nearly impossible, for a woman alone to take care of herself in that culture. So under Mosaic law, someone could marry her so that she would basically have a life. But there were rules about the way that worked. And that's this thing called a family redeemer. Basically, what this tells us is that Boaz was in some way related to her deceased husband. Could be a cousin, second cousin, that sort of thing. And so that made him the family redeemer. It gave him the right to buy any property that the deceased man had, which would then get money to Naomi so she could take care of herself, and it would keep the land in the family. It also gave him the right to marry Ruth so that she could, live a meaningful life, sort of thing. So basically what she's saying is, I love being part of this family. I care about you. I want to stay in this family. Will you marry me? Now, the good news is that Boaz receives that really well. That she was right. There really was affection there. He's deeply moved and tells her that he does want to marry her. But again, there are rules for how these things work. So many rules. And the rules about this family redeemer concept is that there is actually a pecking order. Who has the first right to marry her? Whoever's most closely related to the deceased has first right of refusal, which seems bizarre to us. I get it. And Boaz says, there's a guy ahead of me in line. You have to ask him first, in effect, before I can do it. But Boaz says, don't worry, I'll take care of that for you. I will get this sorted out, and we will get this problem solved. So he gets Ruth back home, and the next day Boaz does just as he promised. He goes out into the town square in the place where people do business, and he waits. He waits for the man who actually has the first right to buy the property and marry Ruth. And when he comes by, clearly Boaz has a plan. Boaz is not going to leave this up to chance. He wants to make sure that he is the one who gets to marry Ruth. So he goes about things in a really specific way. So basically, as he sees the man, he says, hey, you heard about Naomi? Remember Naomi who had moved away and her husband died and her kids died? Well, she's back in town and she's selling that piece of land. Did you want to buy that piece of land? And of course the man's like, well, that'd be a win. That's a really good piece of property. That's a really good investment. Sure, I'll buy that land. So now what he would have done in that case is that he would have bought the land, he would own the land, and he would also be responsible to give Naomi a home. But Naomi's older. She's not going to live much longer. This is a really good business deal. The guy's kind of like, I'll win in this deal. Sure, I'll do that. But then Bo goes, oh yeah, there's one other thing though. Of course, your purchase of the land requires that you marry Ruth, the Moabite. Well, it's like, well, she's young, she's energetic. That seems okay, I guess. Oh yeah, and there's one more thing. That way, she can have children who will carry on her husband's name and keep the land in the family. Now, this is a more technical message than I usually like to get into, but we kind of have to do this. Here's how this whole Redeemer thing works. It's kind of nuts to us. Is that basically, if you buy the land, you got to marry the Ruth, right? The reason that's happening is because Ruth's deceased husband will never have a family line. So what has to happen is they get married. If they have children, and he's kind of supposed to make sure she does have children, that land leaves him, goes to those children considered to be the deceased husband's children. And here's what makes that more complicated. It's okay for this guy to already be married with children. So basically what just went down here is that, oh yeah, you can buy that land and you're going to give Naomi whatever it's worth, which is probably a fair amount of money. You can hold on to it for a few years, but once you and Ruth have kids, those kids inherit that land. Your kids, which you consider your kids, will get none of it. But Boaz is going about this way to get the guy really excited and then knock him down. Because Boaz really wants to marry Ruth. And if you see what's going on here is that for the man who first says, I'll buy it, he's like, I'm all in on this as long as it's a win for me. But the second, it wasn't a win for him. The second, it was about taking care of other people instead of his own interests. He says, you know what? I don't think I like that land so much after all. And I don't think I really want it. And everything works out just the way Boaz wanted it to. So Boaz publicly declares that he will buy the land, that he will marry Ruth, and he does. And then from there, he and Ruth have children. And the thing to understand here is that Boaz has given up a great deal to get to this point, technically. He's given money to Naomi that will never come back to him. He has to give Naomi a home until she dies. He marries Ruth, so he's giving her a home as well. And the children that they have will not be considered his. They will be considered the deceased husband's. But we could say, well, that's kind of romance, right? That's kind of how romance works. But it's clearly so much more than that, right? Is that what he's really interested in doing is caring for these other people, right? And that's how this story started 2 weeks ago. This all started when Ruth was more interested in caring for Naomi than she was in caring about herself. And as Naomi cared more about Ruth than she cared about herself. And this whole sequence begins and leads to this kind of family being built that may not look like an everyday family. It kind of looks like a modern family now, right? Where we're all kind of intermingled. Things aren't as simple as they once were. But you know what? We're still a family, and we still take care of each other. We still take care of each other, and we still give ourselves to each other. And this would be a great story if it all just stopped right there. But it doesn't stop right there. Because it turns out that when we begin to invest ourselves in others without regard for what we get back from it, the reach of what we do is so much bigger and farther than we could ever imagine. And just as that's true for us, that is also true for Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Now this part's going to take a diagram, so stay with me. So we start out with three main characters. Right? Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Right? Naomi's the older woman. Ruth is the young lady who kind of the story's named after. Boaz is the wealthier man. Remember that Naomi had a son, and Ruth married that son. But he died. That's what got us this whole Redeemer thing, right? So Ruth and Boaz get married to one another. They actually have a son whose name is Obed. So now biologically, Obed is Ruth and Boaz's. And also practically speaking, he is as well. That son would grow up in their household, would grow up with their traditions and so forth. But here's the thing that's kind of odd. Legally, that son belongs to Naomi. So what's happening is it's extending the family line of Naomi. So what we have here now is this Obed is kind of descended from these three people. And that seems okay, kind of neat, kind of factoid, right? But Obed gets married one day and has a son, and his son's name is Jesse. Now, if you're a big Bible person, that name may start to look familiar, but to many of us it may not. But then Jesse gets married one day and has a son, and that son is King David, the greatest king in ancient Israel's history. The king who saved the lives of millions of people. The king who led his people into freedom. He led his people into a level of life they could have never imagined. And Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz are all part of that. Because they didn't focus on their own interests, they focused on the interests of others. Now, if we stopped right there, that'd be a really good story. But who else descends from David? Jesus. What that means is that Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz, they did not focus on their own interests. They focused on each other's needs. They focused on what the lives of the others required. Because they cared about other people and used whatever they had to care for one another, they got to be part of God's redemptive plan for humanity. They got to be part of the family line of Jesus. But here's the deal. We all have that exact same opportunity. We are called to be part of God's redemptive plan for humanity. How? By inspiring people to pursue and find life in Jesus. What we see here is that if we only focus on what's in front of us, we don't see all the opportunity that's out there. What we want to do is that we want to care for the people in front of us, knowing that God will take that farther when we're willing to step into it. When we're willing to use what we have. whether that's our talents, whether that's our time or our resources, to step out into the lives of other people, expecting nothing in return, simply trying to connect them and inspire them, to show them that there's a life that's more fulfilling, that there's a way to make a difference. God will then take that little bit that we have, that amount that we invest in someone else, and then God starts to multiply that. And before you know it, you've got a king and you've got a savior that all started with one person, Ruth, saying, Naomi, I'm not going to leave you alone. I'm going to walk through life with you. That's what we are called to do. Do what we can with what we have, and God will multiply it beyond imagination. It will enrich our lives, it will enrich the lives of those around us, and we will get to be part of a bigger plan and a bigger outcome than we ever could possibly dream of.